What we're going to be discussing today is synthetic data in the focus of financial crime, and we have a nice breadth of experience with some very well-placed people in their various areas of study. And what we're going to do is essentially go through 4 bullets. We're going to start with what is the current state that we have with financial crimes and synthetic data. Then what's the promise that's coming through synthetic data? Next, we'll go into what some of those challenges are, and then finally we will wrap up with the privacy and security and the sensitive data aspect of this, which is always the elephant in the room when we're talking about data, especially in the European Union. I, by the way, am Paul Starrett. I am founder and data scientist at privacylabs.ai. I have an even mixed of legal, technical, and data science background, so as well as having started in fraud. I'm a certified fraud examiner. So that's why I'm so central in this area. That's me. What I'm going to do is now ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves in alphabetical order, which also accommodates ladies first. So Anette, if you could tell us about yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anette Fong. I'm Head of Compliance Solutions at INS. It's a law firm, but it provides legal advisory, business consultancy, and also technology solutions to help clients basically, solve problems. Prior to joining INS, I was Head of Compliance and also MLRO for a number of large financial institutions, working in the sectors of investment banking, asset management, and also the broker-dealer world.
Great. Graham, I think you're next in the alphabet, if you would.
Thank you. So my name is Graham Barrow. I already know that some of the people online know me because I know them. Those of you who don't, I suppose I'm probably best known because I'm half of a podcast called The Dark Money Files, which is now into its 7th season and some 70 odd episodes where we cover the entire range of financial crime related news and technical elements. But I also do a couple of other things. I work with banks to help them understand the strength of their controls in terms of anti-financial crime. And I also work with a global network of journalists investigating real financial crime. And on top of that, as if that's not enough, because I am greedy, I also work with a whole bunch of technology companies to apply some of the things I've learned through those investigations to new technology to see if we can automate what is currently quite manual.
Fabulous. And I guess that leaves Hendrik. And by the way, I went out of turn. So Hendrik, yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Hendrik. I'm a Director of Data Science Analytics here at Tide. And so we are building data engineering function, a data science function, and analytics function, and now also starting data governance. I'm also the host of the FinML meetup, so a very warm welcome to all of you. And yeah, before joining Tide, I was building data science team for primarily credit startups, both in Germany and in the UK.
Fabulous. See, I told you, this is a very esteemed, reputable, very well-placed group that I'm in here. So great, thank you. And by the way, with regard to questions, folks, if you would put your questions in the chat, we do plan to take those at the end of what we expect to be roughly 30 minutes. If I'm getting too carried away, that'll probably be more like 35. But at the end there of the 35 minutes, we will then have the remainder of the time for your questions. So if you put them to chat, that would probably be best. With that said, let's start off with our first question is, what is the current state of synthetic data in the area of financial crime? And I think when we discussed this earlier, we found really 2 main issues. There was sort of a privacy aspect and then a lack of data. So Anette, if I could ask you to pick up with the privacy issues that you see in the current state.
Yeah, I just think it's important to set the scene first, and picking up, on some of Graham's points, that he articulated, from the experiences he shared, because there's a real rigorous compliance, regulation and requirements environment to start off with. There's just growing volumes of data that we need to contend with. As Graham said, a lot of firms and that have manual processes, and as well as legacy systems, and just generally the complexity of the global financial markets. And, especially if we concentrate just on the regulatory aspects, from a privacy perspective, it's very restrictive on how information, can be shared and disclosed. And that's one of the difficulties, from a personal and operational perspective, is that, when you're working with data, you may find, really useful patterns, But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to share because you don't want to, still need to hide that individual kind of identity. So, you know, from that perspective, both internally and externally, it's different. It's very difficult to be able to say, okay, I have found something that is potentially suspicious, I need to look into, but I can only go so far because I can't reveal that individual person, or if not, that person connected to that customer transaction.
Yes. And before I get to the technical aspect, because what I think you just mentioned leads nicely into the issue of the lack of data. But I should mention, for those of you who are not as familiar with synthetic data, the idea is that we take underlying real data and then generate new patterns from that data to sort of flesh out a larger, robust set of data that we can work with, which gives us greater capabilities. So with that said, Hendrik, do you have an opinion then on what I see as sort of the anemic aspects of what's available to data science, and how maybe synthetic data plays a role there?
Yeah,
the current state, excuse me.
Well, I think it's very similar to what Anette said. So the clear benefits of synthetic data is it is one of the methods that you can actually share data across different organizations. Also, if there are any kind of regulatory restrictions that you have internally that prevent you from accessing certain data sets, it might be a way to synthesize that data to make it available in that way. It's interesting, I think, to put it into context and like what are the other options that you have in that area. So I think like it competes in my mind with trying to desensitize data. So that means like stripping out any sensitive data from the data sets that you're working with. And then there are also now some techniques where you can try to train models on potentially data sets that you've never seen in the past. All of them have different pros and cons.
Yes, and we did have a question, which we will discuss later from Vessela, about bias and how this might be solution. We'll bring that up later. Graham, do you have any thoughts based on your background on the current state and what the challenge with data is and your ability to marshal your efforts along, or others,
Yes.
those of others?
Yes, I think there's also, I mean, I absolutely get this sharing of data, but I actually think within firms there are issues about how we deal with data. And let me kind of elaborate on that. It's really important dealing with financial institutions to understand when you have first line and second line, their needs and requirements are really quite different. And I kind of typify it with this. The first line cares about false negatives and the second line cares about false the first line cares about false positives and the second line care about false negatives. And the issue that you have is that a lot of the focus is on, we need to get rid of all of these false positives because we're drowning in people who spend all their day saying it's not a problem. Whereas if I'm an MLRO, what keeps me awake at night are false negatives, because that's what's going to come back and bite me. Now, the issues often with real data is that if you test your controls with your own real data and you find a whole shed load of false negatives, you've now given yourself a problem. So in a way, I really like the idea that synthetic data that is predictive of control outcomes is a fabulous way of testing your controls for potential issues without immediately exposing yourself to a problem as a regulator, because you now have this huge drowning in potential suspicious activity, which you can't just now ignore. So I'm with you entirely on that sharing data using, you know, or the learnings from data across firms through synthetic data. But I do think it's an additional powerful tool internally to refine your control environment without giving yourself a massive headache of, I now have 17,000 transaction monitoring reports I've got to investigate.
And I agree with Graham there in regards to controls outcome, or what we term, you know, behaviours or profiling, because before we started, you know, looking at, you know, patterns and things like that, it was really threshold based, you know, in the sense that, you know, is it a certain volume they're trading over? Is it a certain value they're trading over? But that's not how, as you know, more and more we look at, you know, kind of fraudsters or money launderers. It's really how they behave in a transaction and how they interact, you know, within each of the stakeholders in the financial system.
That's a very interesting nuance, and that's one of the reasons why your input is so very, very valuable. I think this is a great way to segue into our next bullet point, which is the promise of synthetic data. I had meant to put that question initially to Edgar, who is a panelist who I think maybe he and his wife are unavailable. She is due to have a baby any day, so we don't know. But in any event, if I could just pinch hit for him for just a second, but then I'll go to Hendrik and each of the three of you, is that I think the promise is that when you, as Graham mentioned with the false negatives and false positives, that's really sort of the bane of any data science and machine learning effort, but especially in financial crime where you have such horrible sanctions and some of the GDPR things we'll get to later. But the ability to take even within an institution, to take their underlying data, their underlying threat model, and to expand on that and extrapolate out new hidden areas that were prior to that unknown, and to be able to bring past known other topologies into that to kind of enrich it, give you a much better data set from which to help wrangle the false positives, which we know are very difficult for banks because of the amount of time they spend chasing false positives. And then the issue of what snuck under the radar in false negatives, what risks are going on, you don't even know are there. So I think that the promise on the technology side is there. But I think maybe, Hendrik, given that you are a data scientist, maybe I can pass that off to you to continue with.
Yeah, so what I thought was really interesting coming out of this and discussing it a little bit is this idea of like, I think from a data science side, it would be called like transfer learning. So this idea is like, we can actually learn patterns, and we can learn a distribution of like how fraud relates to transaction patterns from like certain data sets, and then we can adjust that to a new data set that we get. So we can go to a new company and can apply the typologies that we learned, the fraud that was done for things that previously hasn't been flagged up, and see that as well in the new data. So see that as well for this new company that now comes in. So this kind of knowledge sharing, I think, is really, really interesting from my perspective.
Yes, I'd agree. I think that when we spoke actually earlier about the ability, maybe there's some sort of reticence that people have with using this new data, but you can compare the new data to the old. That is to say, the original underlying data that was the inspiration for the new synthetic data. You can take that second set of that new data set and compare it to the original, so that you know where you're going with things. Graham, do you have any thoughts there on the false positive, false negative, and what your personal opinion is with the area of synthetic data?
Yeah, and I think there's the kind of an elephant in the room here, which is that, and it doesn't just apply to synthetic data, it applies across a whole range of new technologies, which is explainability.
Yes.
And the problem that you have with synthetic data and others, or the challenge that you face, is that these technologies are quite specialist, and sometimes people don't grasp exactly what it is. So I mean, some people think synthetic data is the same thing as anonymized data, which it isn't.
Yes.
So I think take up, and one of the challenges that we're going to have is as much about, can we assure people that what maybe people like Hendrik, who are data scientists, who can read the statistics and the output that comes, is rendering that in a way that the decision makers, the people who hold the budget, the people who make the decisions, the people here in the UK who are in the senior managers and certification regime, who have personal accountability, they are the ones that we're going to need to win in this conversation, because if we don't win over them, none of this is going to make any difference, because they won't adopt it.
Yeah, and if I can just pick up on Graham's point, there's two phases or two areas on this as well, because one, as he mentioned, in regards to, the explainability of data, having my MLRO or compliance hat on, is like, when the regulators ask me during a review, how did you derive either that decision, or how do you derive in regards to what your controls are? And I need to explain, okay, with the data that I'm using, where did it come from? And it's difficult because, you know, that's why it's so good to work in partnerships. And as Graham said, to work with tech companies, and each of us are subject matter experts, right? That you need to able to have those capabilities joined together, because without Hendrik in that, I would not be able to describe, okay, where did I get this data from? It's just a data set or a data dump, right? And without, you know, Graham's previous experience as well, it's like, well, how with that data did I know what scenarios that I wanted, you know, to put in? And the other thing is as well, it's just the completeness and accuracy of data. It's true, garbage in, garbage out, right? So we all know that large firms have a lot of legacy systems. Locating the data is there's issues, right? And then it's like, you know, integrating and putting the data together is going to be issues as well. So I think that's where synthetic data kind of helps in that perspective, because if you can actually bespoke or pre-pack your data sets to be able to look at scenarios and that, it's easier. I don't like the word, but I'll put inverted commas, manipulate what you want. And not only that, where you find there's something missing in a criteria, you may be able to kind of generate that data as well.
Yes, and I think this segues nicely. And by the way, the term MLRO, I'm in the States, I'm in Silicon Valley, so I'm well away from the other panelists here. I believe is a money laundering reporting officer.
That's correct.
Got it. Okay, for those of us who are still coming along, that leads us, I think, nicely into our next bullet, which is the issues that are involved here as well. We've already touched on some, and again, we do have a question that seems to be coming up as an ongoing thing about bias. And I think, as with any machine learning effort, explainability is always an issue. Interpretability, other terms I've heard, that is a precursor to understanding bias. But I think, just as with all machine learning efforts, by the way, that's the area that I specialize in, is explainability and audit and things like that for machine learning. So that's why I'm so keen to this, is that as with any machine learning effort, if you build explainability into the model at the outset, you are in far better place to have this not become something that hits you later. So I think maybe getting into our third bullet, because we do want to sort of keep an eye on the clock here. I think, Hendrik, do you have a position or some thoughts on how to go about that, and what do we think? How promising is this? Is this something that we can build into the process from the outset, and how you might approach that?
So I think, like, it's an interesting question, right? Like, how do you know, like, what is the, like, which parts of your synthetic data are being captured by the underlying data, which is, as far as I'm aware, not an easy problem to answer. And it's also a question of, like, yeah, to what degree do you want to do that here on within the synthetic data part, and given that you're learning certain things, and then, so I think that the question comes down to me is, like, to what degree do you want to build like some kind of model that actually predicts some outcomes, in this case fraud or not, or to what degree do you want to only, like, replicate the data that encompasses these patterns? So like building a model is in many ways like a simpler problem than recreating, like, everything in terms of the whole synthetic data. But I do think, to not dodge the question completely, I do think that in order to get some kind of insight on how your, in this case, fraudulent labels are actually being generated, it is quite important to have systems that create explainability, such as sharp values, available, so that you can explain to your auditors, like, what are the patterns that the models are being built on. And then also for you to understand, did we actually learn the correct data? Like, did the underlying data set that we use in order to generate the synthetic data actually have the correct, didn't have any biases, so was in any way correct in that sense?
So it sounds like we have a lot of things going on as far as data we have to synthesize and build out. There's explainability and bias. There's the ability to deal with false negatives and false positives. I think I have some thoughts there that are best left for the next bullet, I think. But Annette, I don't know if you have any thoughts about the competition here, in a sense, I'm seeing with regard to the ability to be accurate and the ability to be fair. And then Graham, I would think that you would have equal thoughts here. So maybe we can just go between the two of you. Maybe Annette, if you could address that first.
There is, I'm just thinking, you know, to bring this live in the sense of personal kind of experiences. And when I was part of the FCA, which is Financial Conduct Authority, AML tech sprint, and that was really good, you know, because there was a lot of kind of lessons learned in that perspective. And we were involved in one project called Catch the Chameleon. And that's the thing, you know, the fraudsters, money launderers always come in different guises. You know, they may open an account in one bank as an individual and use their British passport. They may go to another bank and use another passport. Or if not, they open an account, you know, whereby it's their company and they're the ultimate beneficial owner and can open an account in the same company. But again, because of data issues, legacies and that, you would never kind of put them together. And because of that, and in trying to solve for that, it's like, then it's, you know, like, how can you do that without breaking some Chinese walls between, say, the investment bank and the retail bank, because they're different legal entities type thing. And when we were looking at anonymization, you know, we reached a brick wall whereby it's like, well, how far do you anonymize whereby you cannot identify that individual? And, you know, it's like, well, at that point in time, anonymization was the only thing that was available type thing. And now with synthetic data, where I feel that, you know, it does help, especially in the usability, is that you can then, you know, share with other banks, you know, not only internally, but externally. So you've got scenarios whereby you've got the bank, you've got the customer, you've got the merchant, you've got the payments company, you've got the fraudster, right? And be able to work together to be able to, you know, bring scenarios together. And, you know, what we were trying to do is see if we can get a SUPAZAR, which is a suspicious activity report, that would help the whole industry, you know, recognize that, you know, this particular person, launderer or fraudster, is going from one bank to another, because we can't do that at the moment.
Yes, and Graham, I would imagine that you see, how would you assess that the ability to accommodate the elephant room of explainability, but the ability to as well to accommodate the fraud patterns and so forth? How would you see that playing out?
I mean, it's an interesting question, and I mean,
excuse me, feel free to repose the question. if
well,
you want to take it another direction, I'm more than happy.
That's fine. I mean, clearly, you know, we're going to get to a point where the technology itself is going to pose us challenges, and we need to have those conversations now, because at the moment, the way that the synthetic data is being built and the way that AI generally is working is that we understand typological behavior, and we're using that typological behavior to train machine learning and to produce synthetic data. I guess one of the things that we're hopeful of is that actually ultimately the machine learning will itself start learning from live data as it's going along, and will, as it were, on the fly, start identifying new or emerging typologies that it can then alert you to, or produce synthetic data to simulate. Now, there's going to become a point, I think, where that's going to be problematic, because explainability is going to become very hard, because the machine is now doing stuff that we don't understand. Yeah. So that's, I think we're going to get to a point, and I could be wrong here, but that's my understanding. I've already been talking to a couple of firms who are producing machines that produce 100 models and will then self-select the model it believes is most appropriate to the data that you're feeding it. So this is, how do you explain that? And particularly when you explain it to an audience which is becoming more disconnected from the levels of technicality that are required to make these things work. We live in a world now that, if you go back 200 years, your entire world was the one you personally experienced. You knew things were true because you did them. You knew how to make a table. You knew how to give, you know, assist a birth of a child. You know, all of those things were through direct experience, because that's all you had. We now live in a world where I suspect about 99% of everything we know and do, we take on trust, because we don't have, you know, my my phone turns on and I can talk to people, I would find it hard to explain how all that happens. The algorithms involved in sending mobile phone messages through the airwaves are fantastically complex. So I think, I'm not sure that's the answer you were looking for, but that's my poser is explainability is going to get to a point where it becomes intrinsically impossible to do it.
I agree.
So I think like there are two things. So I think probably just on a technical level, the way that explainability like evolved these days, it really takes the model as a black box. So it completely like is abstracted these days from the internals of what a model does specifically. So I'm not particularly worried about that these theories would diverge in some sense. That being said, I think though, like the kind of broader societal question that's behind this is, there's a premium you're paying in terms of like accuracy of the model. So the degree to which you can like catch fraud in this case, and the degree to which you can actually like look into the very details that you have with this model. And the beauty, I guess, in modern technology is that we can actually give you that trade-off. You can build like a very detailed model where we can't look maybe as deeply in there, but it gives you like better accuracy results. So it catches more fraud with a lower cost. Or we can do something simpler that maybe doesn't have as good accuracy, but is much more understandable. And there are different pros and cons to these two.
And that's going to require, sorry to jump in, but that's going to require quite a significant conversation with regulation at the moment. Whatever they might talk about outcome focused, it isn't really, it's process focused. And if you can't produce the steps along the way, you're going to have a problem. I think if I understand you right, Hendrik, what you're saying is that at some point it will all be about the outcomes, and we shouldn't worry so much about how we got there, because frankly it may not be easy to itemize all of those steps. But if the outcomes are the right outcomes, we should accept them on their own merits. But I think that's going to be quite a difficult journey to take the regulators on, however much they might say they're happy about it, because it's a very different form of regulation.
It's true. And just picking up, one of, I guess, the points that Hendrik made just on society, there is a societal cost as well. And, when we're talking about privacy, and Paul, you mentioned, kind of GDPR, is that, with privacy, it's about our own data. So it's very protective, of sharing that or trying to disclose it. We live in such, a world where while you're using technology with social media and that, like sometimes you don't know where your data kind of ends up. And, there have been breaches of, data being leaked or ending up, somewhere else kind of in a black box type thing. And only that, from a GDPR perspective, it's obvious in regards to the fines. You're looking at 18 million, or if not 4% of, kind of your global turnover. So firms are afraid of that, when it comes to, and that's why they're protective, of using data and personal data. And, from a financial crime perspective, it's more difficult because you sometimes don't see, kind of the effects or the harm it has done to society, whether it's the money laundering, the human trafficking and that. So that's kind of sometimes, the challenge and the tug of war, with both. And I think, that's where synthetic data may help, because again, it takes the personal information out of it.
Yes, and I think actually this segues nicely into our last bullet, which has to do with privacy. And I think you just stated it well, the tug of war, that banks don't want to give up their data because they're afraid it's going to leak and they're going to wind up getting hit with GDPR fines. But at the same time, they've got the money laundering sanctions and whatever damage might come from if there was that kind of activity, the reputational hit they might take. So they're kind of stuck in between. I wonder though, to me, this seems to be a risk analysis question, that you have to somehow go through some process of discussing your specific situation and how you balance those two competing interests. And that if you do that properly, you record it, that you're in a place to defend yourself, either to a regulator or even a lawsuit that might come by way of, data breach laws have been quite onerous. Maybe there's a reasonableness question there. So leading into that, Annette, I kind of had thought to put you to this next bullet, this last one, to you first, is to say, maybe what on a risk-based analysis, and then Hendrik and Graham, obviously your input would be invaluable. But and then also there are exceptions to GDPR. There are exceptions that we might leverage in the process to say, well, we have some proper purpose for it, or there's some other consent that's involved. So maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel with this. Any thoughts you have, Annette, would be perfect.
Oh, no, definitely so, because it always is about a defensible position when you're looking at a risk-based approach, and that's what Graham and I kind of discussed previously. That a lot of firms now, in regards to proportionality or relevance, de-risk, because at the end of the day, especially with the economic environment we're living in, right, there's a cost factor. How many people do I need to look at this, compared to utilizing technology? Or if I de-risk so far, I don't have to look at, these false positives or things like that. So from that perspective, whereby that again, for the financial markets, it was always like, oh, well, FX is high risk, but, bonds is low risk because it's delivery versus payments. But Graham could tell you otherwise on the experiences that he's seen. And you're right, because there are, if there is a legal purpose, for sharing that data or disclosing that data, but at the moment, there's still kind of that fear to work out exactly how, that can be done. And where there's fear, the firms are reluctant to do it.
And maybe synthetic data is the answer. Graham, did you have? She mentioned your name, so I figured.
Yeah, and I know where that was going because
right.
That was a tilt at the mirror trades. And isn't it interesting that actually once some of these things are brought out into the open, people look and think, oh yeah, that's actually quite an obvious way you could do that, but it needs the creative thinking of criminals to work it out in the first place. I mean, I'm with Annette. I mean, at the moment we're in a situation, people are so nervous about GDPR, they're actually not going as far as they can with their data because no one's drawn the battle lines yet clearly enough to understand what we can do in comfort and what is pushing the margins. And I think 4% of whatever turnover is enough of a sanction for firms to be quite nervous about GDPR. And all of those that I've spoken to, even where they've taken legal opinions, have tended to err on the side of caution, even if they've been told this is a legitimate use for this data. Now, set that against a global situation, and I mean, it's much worse for global banks because very often they have operations in countries where the data laws are incredibly strict. Russia would be one where you cannot export data out of Russia for any purpose. So Switzerland obviously would be another. I know an MLRO who actually quite liked that because he got an annual trip to Switzerland because the only place he could sign off on files was by going and sitting in a room and having them put in front of him. Mexico is another. So there are these places around the world which have incredibly strict data laws. And again, that's an opportunity for synthetic data to effectively move across borders and do a lot of the things you need that data to do without obviously circumventing or challenging the internal laws of those countries. So I think the whole data privacy thing is an incredibly important conversation, which is how much do we want to compromise our own personally identifiable information in order to improve our economies by expunging dirty money from it. And I think Annette's spot on. At the moment, we're far more sensitive about our data than we are about a few people buying very expensive houses in nice parts of London with money that no one has a clue where they got it from. And that's the challenge that we have to address head on.
Yes, and Hendrik, I was going to sort of put a question to you, but I just wanted to insert that here in the United States, things aren't quite as onerous, I think, with regard to, now we are subject to GDPR, there's exceptions, of course, but our pain point is data breaches. So even though we're not quite as far along as the European Union and the UK in privacy as a, not just a right, it's a fundamental right. We are more interested in the money, of course, that's what we're about, right? We're all about it, but is the breach, is that if my information is stolen and is then used to perpetrate fraud, that's a whole other issue for us. But I was just going to think as we get sort of round down here, we get some of our questions. Henrik, my personal feeling, sort of in on a positive note, into Graham's and Annette's points, I see promise here, because I think if we start at the outset really understanding what's missing, whether it's too much bias in data, too much weight to the question in a minute here, but that there's some positivity here, that when you as a data scientist have to approach the idea of your underlying data and what you don't have, the regulators and your internal people who are responsible for that, and to say, well, listen, we do have this added ability to go to synthetic data to help us fill in the holes, to help us build out false positives and negatives, balance that against what data we need and what profiling we're doing and so forth. Would you agree that's maybe there's some positivity there? And then Graham and Annette, you're certainly welcome to.
So one thing that I think is interesting about the idea about synthetic data is that you could potentially approve certain data sets that are declared as like fine, unbiased, or whatever, and then try to build models against that. That I think might be an interesting way that the regulator could kind of whitelist in that way, like certain data sets that would then allow more space for companies to do things where like you're kind of whitelisted on that sense. And obviously that would also allow you to not have any privacy concerns around that either. Yes. We do have 2 more questions in the chat, by the way.
I've just been looking at them. They're really interesting.
Yes, okay. Why don't we get to those?
One of the points, one of the attendees about funnel vision, and I totally agree, because where I guess financial crime or even compliance started was a real tick box approach. This was the process. This is what you followed. And whereby, you do get, I guess, customer due diligence or financial crime analysts, right? Whereby that day in, day out, if that's what they do, they tend to then not understand what basically they're trying to look for, which is very important that, as part of that, they need to understand the business, right? Just like the business needs to understand compliance and kind of data. And that's what I've always encouraged, because, when you understand what the business does, the products they offer, the services, the transaction flows, how it's done, it's much easier to be able then to put scenarios together or think of scenarios. It goes back to Graham's point. Sometimes you've got to think like a criminal. And really outside of that box. It's so important. And, the regulators have emphasized that, gone away, is a tick box approach. You just have to be smarter in what you do, and especially with real life situations in that perspective. So that's one point, whereby, yes, in regards to, a central fraud authority, that has been, I guess, raised. And I know YouGov recently, did a survey whereby that, is something like that more trustworthy than it is, for maybe a private entity or an NGO to look at it. I just think it's the willingness of trying to get these things together now of all participants, kind of, bringing it to life.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Gimlet to a degree is trying to do that. I mean, one of the things that Gimlet's trying to do is to horizon scan emerging typologies and cascade that back out to banks. I mean, there's an old saying which I love: is if you keep on doing what you've always done, you'll keep on getting what you've always got. And that is kind of the funnel vision. Is if you base everything on what's always happened in the past, you are more than one step behind the criminals who are always looking for in the future what can we do differently. So I think that's it's just one of the most successful workshops I ever do is oddly doing what we just talked about, which is taking a group of people into the room, positing the fact that they've got a whole load of money and their job is now to launder it. And of course, what it does is it forces a mind shift from focusing on the controls, which is what they normally do, to focusing on where are the gaps in our controls, which is a very different mindset. And it's powerful because people start coming up with, we could do this and we could do that. Yeah. Are people doing that at the moment? I don't know. Well, think we probably need to find out. So you know, that paradigm shifting is just really important. And it just occurs to me now, using good quality synthetic data could be a great way of simulating a lot of those situations, so that without risking their entire reputations, banks can start doing some of that. And if that is being seeded through sharing of typologies from lots of different organizations, it becomes a very powerful tool.
Yes, there's also, I know, a corollary with information security, which I do spend some time in, what are called national vulnerability databases, where they share between everyone what the threats are. And there's also a thing called an ISAC. It's going to escape me, the information security something or other. It's a similar thing where banks, or depending on the different, whether it's in healthcare, they have their own and they share it, and they spread it around quickly and in a very democratized way. But
Yep.
I think with one thing that you can do with synthetic data is that you can build what's called a pre-trained model. And what that becomes to the question that was posed is that you can amass data from all kinds of different banks. If it's anonymized enough, or if it's you can then amass this sort of central place where people can learn topologies in ways that are not biased or otherwise violative of privacy and data protection laws. So I think there's promise there. And I think that's something actually ELAX is working on, is that type of pre-trained model.
Speaking of, I think Edgar just joined the call.
Yes, this is Joy. Yes.
Hey.
Edgar, your timing is...
Yes.
Welcome.
I had some inconvenience, so I couldn't make it earlier.
I see.
But I'm pretty sure I'm going to follow the recording because it's going to be awesome.
Well, your timing is good in a way, because we were just rounding out some concepts. Since you're here now, if you could maybe catch us up on where you see. Well, I'm trying to balance what we have left. We have questions that are remaining, but maybe if you could spend 2, 3, 4 minutes on where you see the promise of synthetic data, specifically with the ability to deal with false positives and negatives, but then to balance that with explainability and bias, because that is through our conversation become kind of where we are. So if you can address that, that would be very timely.
Yes, thank you. Well, first, I don't know how much had you been saying about this, but I had been in the very beginning of my research struggling to get financial data. I think confidentiality was one of the issues that in the very beginning I got as a motivation to actually start generating synthetic data. So for those who doesn't know me, I just have a very quick introduction. I have been a researcher in the area of financial data for the last 10 years, and I'm the founder of a company in the UK called ELAX that produces synthetic data sets for a particular case that is financial crime analytics. So in the beginning, it was just a replacement for real data, but then later on, I started to understand some of the problems that we have with machine learning, like the unbalanced data sets, like the lack of labels, and also the evolving threat of financial crime. So being able to actually generate synthetic data with these labels is a little bit like the producing the synthetic vaccine for the COVID. So you produce the synthetic vaccine, you inject it into the body, and once actually the body starts to recognize this fingerprint of the virus, then they develop the antibodies. And this is exactly the reason why I'm promoting the evolution of synthetic data as one of the, let's say, the next best practices for machine learning to actually understand all these fingerprints. And there are so many ways to actually address this problem. And I think synthetic data is going to play a very important key role in reducing the false positives and discovering new false negatives, increasing this effectiveness. I hope, well, I didn't take that much time, but I hope this clarifies a little bit this area. And once again, I apologize for being late here.
No, we understand. And it's we were able to kind of cover things, I think, fairly adequately, but your input would have been helpful, but I think we're doing pretty well. We have you still here. We do have about 10 minutes left here. So we do have one question. I hope we've accommodated the last two. Well, there's another question about Mexico here, but regarding
I can quickly answer that if you want me to.
Yeah,
about
please.
what happens. I mean, because I did a spell in Mexico for HSBC, so I can actually answer this from
There you go.
personal experience. Yeah, in 2011. So draw your own conclusions from that one. And the answer is that things like KYC and other data, you have to hold a local KYC in Mexico in the same way as you have to hold a local KYC in Russia. You cannot access a global KYC. You have to have it there. It can't leave Mexico. You have to keep it within systems that are not accessible from outside of Mexico. Same with your transaction data. So, I mean, obviously you can transact with other countries, but the data that you hold about those clients in Mexico has to stay in Mexico. I think it's even stricter in Russia. So it is a problem if you're a global bank, and it creates islands of data which are difficult to connect, which is why, again, potentially synthetic data which can replicate local activity without exposing the underlying sensitive data is potentially an incredibly important way for banks to understand local situations which are anomalous to its global transaction activity or its global take on of clients.
Well, we just had another question sneak in here about Mexico. Should the regulations change?
Ask the Mexicans. It's not. I mean, you know,
Maybe that's rhetorical. Maybe that's a rhetorical
yeah,
question. But
I mean, you know, there'll be other people saying, well, should our regulations change then? Because
Yeah.
actually they see that as a way forward, and us being profligate with our data and letting it go all over the world. I'm not a politician, and you now understand why, because I don't really do politics. But yeah, it's a political question and not really a data one. I'm not ducking it. I mean, it just is. By its very nature, that's a question for politicians to deal with.
Yeah, and maybe a quick question to put to Annette, and again, I'm trying to keep the look on time here, is doesn't that mean then that one law that you're obeying maybe help become a defense to another law which you're violating? So if you have to keep your KYC, you know your customer, which is used for those who don't know. KYC is, I'm sure everyone does, but just for the sake of those who may not, KYC, you're required to know who you're doing business with to make sure that they're not nefarious and for whatever are the reasons. But wouldn't that become a defense if I was unable to share information and somehow I was dealing with money laundering, cartel or something? Would that be a defense? I don't know.
It's a sort of defense. Like you've got, tipping off, violations as well, where when you have, something suspicious, you can't, kind of say. And I think that's one thing, with, synthetic data may be able to help, to be able to create a scenario whereby, you can identify that suspicious transaction. It's like, well, then what do you do with it if you, kind of share it on to maybe the group that you're kind of working with? And that's one thing, I think, just picking up on one of your points, Paul, about, alliances. AUSTRAC in Australia has put together something, with the major Australian banks, just recently the Netherlands as well. But again, it's just within those banks that work together, and those banks don't actually have the data. They set up another company, right, for analysts to be there to actually then look at the data and somehow anonymize it in regards to what patterns they're finding, then back to the bank. So yes, it does help in regards to then you'll be able to, look at more and more typologies, what's happening, but you're not really kind of sharing it still within banks. You're still sharing it within another subsidiary. So that adds to the complexity, of the whole kind of data flow in that perspective. And I think, apart from just, if you're looking at just GDPR regulations, it goes back to the complexity, as I mentioned, of the financial system, because it's the complexity of the regulations. You can't look at regulations in isolation either. One goes with another, because, you look at the GDPR, suddenly you look at financial crime. It may be an AML issue, but it also can be a market abuse manipulation issue as well.
Or an ABC issue, a bribery and corruption issue.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very, very challenging. Edgar, I just to get more of your some more airtime from you. We have a question and some thoughts around explainability and the ability of could could synthetic data be used as an answer to explainability? And then we had another question come in about wouldn't that be what you'd want to do? Is that you could then, as you build a model, as you build things along, you could essentially use the synthetic data to tamp down on issues of, or say another way, to better understand what's going on and to accommodate explainability, and how to mix that in with everything else as a best practice. Your thoughts?
Yeah, just to be clear, how much had you been talking about explainability?
Well, I think Graham said it best, that it was the elephant in the room, but it has become a big piece of it because of the regulatory frameworks, GDPR. But it has to be balanced. There's this, as Annette said, it was a tug of war between the ability to accommodate, because when you have private data, people are afraid to share the data. You're losing insights and intelligence that comes to help you with false negatives and false positives. So if you could address that, because you're probably of all everyone here.
So
yeah.
One of the challenges that we have by applying machine learning into the field of compliance is the way to actually explain this black box, because I think at the end what we require is evidence to actually create a very good suspicious activity report that ultimately the authorities will be able to actually understand and prosecute if it's the case. So explainability is quite important. However, there is a tendency in this area that is called the pseudo-explainability. So pseudo-explainability is when you can partially say why, but at the same time, let's say the patterns, the hidden patterns inside the data will help to reduce the huge amount of false positives. So basically, you can actually train two models, one with the hardcore machine learning and another one on top with the pseudo-explainability. So once you actually get let's say the right classifier that will trim down all these false positives, then the next step is to actually understand why this was classified. And then there is an area called pseudo-explainability, and I think that is going to be more relevant. So once you have actually synthetic data, you have a playground, you have an inside, let's say laboratory or digital sandbox, if you call it that way, to experiment and to develop this AI that is actually one of the new trends in trying to be able to explain the AI to avoid problems like the bias that we sometimes find in machine learning.
That's one of the questions that we were talking. I think explainability is a precursor to bias, and I know there are standards on that. It depends on where you are, what the regulations are. We only have a few minutes left, but my sense is that if anyone wants to address this question, please briefly, because we don't have much time, is it seems to me that synthetic data by its very nature is going to obfuscate the underlying data anyway. So that if there's an issue of bias, do we at some point, dilute that? Does it just automatically become an answer in and of itself because it is extrapolating and it's building around and on top, it's obfuscating in its own way? Is that a fair statement? I think it is, but.
So one of the things that occurred to me earlier on, and for years now we've lived with GIGO, which is garbage in and garbage out. I wonder if the new thing is BIBO, which is bias in and bias out. And I mean, it's a great expression, but I'm not aware of our ability to remove bias from how we have data. And so so my concern is that when we're doing this, we always but the first step to not doing it is to recognize your ability to do it and then work out ways of removing bias. I'm not sure we ever will, simply because it's really hard to see your own biases. Other people's are easy, your own are really hard, and that I think is a non-trivial problem to address within this set.
Okay, I think we are just almost at the top of the hour. I think that we can close this off. If we didn't get to your question, we can take that offline. I think we did touch on all the questions. I want to thank our colleagues, my esteemed colleagues, so much. I thought it was a very nice expose, if you will, of the issues. Thank you again so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Hendrik to close out, because this is his platform after all. And thank you all for joining. It was a pleasure to have you on and to have you listen to our thoughts on this.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Paul, for moderating this wonderful webinar. I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for making this possible.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the other panelists. I think we managed to get a really good discussion going. So thanks to all of you. And then to all of our attendants, specifically the ones that asked questions. So Wes, Daniel, Patrish, and Miroslav. I think this really makes the sessions much more lively. So thank you all for chipping in there as well. And yeah, hopefully we'll see most of you again in 2 weeks on the 17th when we do the next one.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a nice evening or morning or afternoon.
Whatever it is.
Okay, cool.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.